Welcome to the Ag Inspo podcast, where we delve into the dynamic world of agriculture, uncovering the stories that inspire, empower, and drive change. Join hosts Rena and Ron Rabo as they explore the journeys of farmers, entrepreneurs, and leaders who are making a difference as they navigate the critical work of transitioning their operation to the next generation. From navigating family dynamics to developing the next generation of ag leaders, we'll bring you the insights and inspiration you need to thrive in today's ever-evolving agricultural landscape. So whether you're a seasoned industry veteran or just starting out, get ready to be inspired, informed, and empowered as we learn from best practices and a few colossal failures on the Ag Inspo podcast.
I am super excited that today we have Mike DeSa with us. He is doing, as our guests always seem to be doing, he is also doing more than one cool and inspirational thing. And so I am very excited to have him. And Mike, where do we find you? What part of the country do we find you in today?
I'm in Northeast Texas.
Okay, Northeast Texas. So it's cold there this morning too, I believe.
Yes, although our sentiments around warm weather in February are different than yours. Ours are, oh no, no, we still have a few more weeks of cold. Please don't bring the summer yet, right? So when we had that warm spell, we touched 85, which were records for some of our areas.
That's a little much. Wow.
And we were like, no, come on, guys. It's like February 15th. We're not ready for this weather yet. It's back down into I think we're at freezing or so now, but different mindset here.
Yeah, I think that is funny about every part of the country that the United States is just so variable based upon where we're located for seasons that we all have our thing that we love to kvetch about and complain about. I guess I would say, I'll put complain in air quotes, but it is really funny, especially when we get some things that are a little out of the norm with seasonality. But I am super excited to jump into what we're going to talk about today, Mike, and I would love it if you could just take a few minutes to introduce yourself to the audience, because I could try to do it, but I will not do it justice. So I would love to have you just let us know what we're going to be talking about and tell us a little bit about yourself.
No, can do. But first, I owe you guys a thank you for giving me the opportunity. Usually I sit on the other side of this, and so it'll be enjoyable to sort of tell the story. My technical background is in agricultural engineering from Texas A&M. I was there on a scholarship with the Marine Corps, a 4-year scholarship. So they paid for school, but I owed them some time in service afterwards. I had always wanted to be a Marine since I was 12. And so I had sort of built a path to get to that point. And so I went to A&M, agricultural engineering. I was an infantry officer with the Marine Corps for 7 years. I spent some time in Haiti, East Africa, in Djibouti, Jordan. I had an Afghanistan deployment in 2011, 2012. Spent my last 2 years teaching, actually, at the infantry officer course just south of Washington, D.C., and then left the service in 2014. At that point, when I left the service, I knew I wanted to do something entrepreneurial, something different, but I didn't quite know what it was yet. I had 3 boys at the time who were 4, 2, and 6 months. And so my wife and I decided, well, now's as good a time as any. So we put everything else we had in storage, and we took some backpacks down to Latin America, actually, for 6 months. We spent some time in Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Panama. We looked at over 100 different agricultural opportunities. The purpose of that trip was for an investment diligence trip for our family. I needed to put some time, if you will, back into the family bank. And it was just to see a different culture. We've always loved to travel. That started in February of 16 and ended in August. We have a small farm that we manage now in Mendoza, Argentina since then. But that sort of reignited my passion for agriculture. And in late 2016, started a consulting company that originally focused on two things. One was farmland diligence trips for the investor community to understand the same opportunities that we got to experience. The second was to build those trips for them. And so we had put a couple of different itineraries together. And as I sort of moved down that path for the next 12 months or so, the diligence and advisory service just gained more steam. And it was through those efforts that I quickly learned about this whole thing called ag tech, right? It wasn't really a thing when I had when I was going through my engineering background at A&M. But when I sort of reemerged now, I realized that this could be something that I would be interested in. And so quickly thereafter, got sucked into the ag tech world and have been there ever since. In 2021, some partners and I came together and formed a platform company that's called Ag Sensor Solutions. So we work exclusively in the plant and animal ag space to help sensor developers and inventors bring their ideas and their products through the commercialization pathway. We can engage as early as an idea out of a university to as late as a product that's already in production that needs optimization, improvement, if it needs to go to a different geography, what that looks like. So we work and have worked in lots of different sort of subsectors within plant and animal ag. Yield monitors, camera systems that are doing AI-enabled detection for pest deterrents, soil moisture probes, both the technology side, but also the market analytics side, wearable technologies for the livestock space, you name it. We've at least done some sort of experience with it. I live in Northeast Texas today on a small farm with my wife and now 4 sons. I think we're done at this point. We've got a little bit of everything, right? Some greenhouses for some hydroponic work, goats, a dozen head of cattle, pigs, chickens, a goose that thinks he's a chicken. And so it's just, it's very much a way of life for us. And so that's my everyday now.
That's actually really fascinating. Because I think that is one thing that all entrepreneurs struggle with is they can get the idea, they can maybe get the idea developed, but that go-to-market strategy and the funding part of it can just seem so incredibly daunting, because a lot of times they are young and maybe don't have networks, things like that. So can you tell me a little bit about how you and your partners came to hit on that idea? Like what was the thing that kind of catapulted you into that space?
So over the prior 6 or 7 years on my end of things, the other partners, 6 decades or so of experience in various forms of productization in ag, we had all sort of came to this realization that more often than not, promising technology just didn't see the light of commercial day. And that wasn't because the idea was bad. That wasn't because the inventor wasn't capable. More often than not, it was because of this realization that it takes a variety of skill sets to be able to do all of those different aspects of bringing a product to market. And the inventor is probably excellent at the technical side of things, right? But they just might not have the skill sets, or they might not have the team, or they might not be in a place where they can focus on the business aspects of this. And so we said, we think we can help with all of those different components under one roof, if you will. And so we like to sort of say today that we're a bridge to commercialization, and that bridge comes from many different directions, but it also goes to different places. And if we can help somebody walk through an engineering challenge, great. If we can help somebody raise capital, that's also something that we work with. If we can help somebody understand a competitive landscape or a market, which we did a few weeks ago for a soil health and monitoring company, then that's where we can sit also. So it was really out of this need that good stuff wasn't making it to where it needed to be, that we said, we think we can probably help with this.
Well, there's a lot of, yeah, I think there's a lot of people that have a lot of ideas out there in agriculture. And certainly one of the big ideas now in following kind of what I'm finding, at least on my farm, that a lot of buyers are interested in and what consumers are interested in. You know, the vast majority, like 87% of the consumers in America, tell us that they want traceability in their food. They want to know where their food comes from. And so I kind of noticed that, you know, on your website and some of what you talk about is this traceability factor. And are you seeing more of that come to the market? And are there ways that that can actually be that can actually be quantified in a sense where we are able to carry that from the producer all the way through all the processors and all the middlemen, all the way to the consumer? And how can that be done? I mean, is that something that people are continuously working on? But
Yeah.
what are some of the ways that you're seeing, and is that indeed the trend?
I think it's the intended trend. Whether it is manifesting as an actual trend yet, I think is probably a bit premature. And how it's being done is a multifaceted approach, both from a technology standpoint, but also from an implementation standpoint. And it also is highly dependent upon what you're trying to trace. Tracing a cattle from a cow-calf operation to the slaughterhouse is much different than tracing corn from the field to the bin, right? You're going to use different technologies. You're going to run into different connectivity requirements. So, I mean, a lot of how you do that depends on what it is you're trying to trace. The specific thing I think you may be referencing from what's on our website is we've spent the last couple of years working on an optical mass flow sensor for cotton harvesters, older style cotton harvesters that don't have yield monitor technology, with a client out of the Tennessee area, and have helped them take this, what then was 20-year-old technology, and sort of bring it into the 21st century. So wrap a communications architecture around it, put a new enclosure on it, think about how it retrofits to older style technologies. How is the data being transferred from the device itself to what it is that's communicating to the cloud, or to what is collecting that information. And what the client has always really been focused on was creating this sort of digital birth certificate, that they call it, for cotton from a field into a gin, and then ultimately into your t-shirts or your curtains, or whatever it is that you're purchasing. But the reason that they're so interested in that is because in the region of the world that they focus on, child labor and other forms of that are prevalent, right? I think 60 to 70% of the world's cotton is still harvested by hand. And so on the downstream end of that, you have global clothing brands that are saying, we would pay a premium for a product that was made from cotton that we knew was not collected or harvested using these means, or that we could say was sustainably produced. But without being able to track that cotton from the field to the gin, you miss that first step in the traceability component. And with the technology that we've worked in partnership with them to build, you can prove through a yield map that that cotton came from that location, but was also harvested by this machine, or a machine, instead of a human. And so there are all kinds of examples where downstream pull, right, or downstream consumer demand is causing technology to insert itself or position itself as a solution set in traceability components. It's a much more difficult challenge when you start talking about livestock. right?
Mhm.
Especially cattle. It is a highly disaggregated market in the US in particular. Most of the operations are under 200 head of cattle. How you get technology adoption down to that level such that you can trace it all the way to a Kroger or a Walmart is something that those brands in particular are still trying to solve. So just a couple of examples of, I think, the consumers pulling through some of those demand, and then some of the ways in which you can do it.
It's really interesting because I wonder, you know, like, do you, in the seat that you're sitting in, do you believe that we will get to a point where people have enough data points to feel comfortable with food and other products that are produced in ag? Do you think that we would ever get to the point where we just destigmatize the fact that farmers are not big, bad, scary people that are trying to ruin our planet, but that they, for the most part, are, producers that care about what they do and are doing the best they can to preserve as many resources as they can? Do you think that this stuff will help with that?
Oh, I don't know if I would, and this is a biased perspective, but I don't know
Sure.
if I would say that farmers in general have this sort of negative stigma attached to them. I certainly, maybe at one point, right? And maybe that stigma is tied to the practices. If
Mhm.
we're going to just say conventional farmers, right? In row crop production, monocrop ag, I think the stigma is maybe more attached to the practice than it is the implementer. Um, and I think that most farmers are likely aware, right, of that stigma and of the impacts of their practices. Now, whether they have the ability to change those practices is a different story, right, and a
Yeah.
different part of the conversation. But I think so. That's maybe a short answer to the question about stigma. I think as those practices start to change, which I think they are, I think there's enough consumer preference now and outcry, frankly, in a lot of ways that um, you are going to see some of these practices move from conventional to regenerative. Now, how that's done and the scale in which that's done is also a different conversation. But will we ever get to a point where we can trace these things down to the farm level? I'm an optimist, right? And I'm someone that loves technology. I would say yes, right? I think it is going to be a long process. I think it's going to be iterative. You're going to see parts of this chain be solved incrementally. I don't think one day you're going to have a company that comes out and says, we can trace an ear of corn from the farm to the feed that you buy, or from the ethanol that you're buying, or the soybean oil that you're buying at the store, right? No one, I think, is going to be able to come out one day with a holistic technology solution that solves all of those challenges. I think it's going to have to be a collaborative approach, and you're going to have to bring in different forms of technology, because to trace something from the field to the bin is one form, and then from the bin to the processing entity is another form. And so it is not a technological one size fits all.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Well,
I think that that's very true, that it has to be collaborative.
well, and I guess from a producer's standpoint, uh, are what are the problems that you would see for producers in that regard? And is this all is this whole movement, is it a net positive always for producers?
Yeah. So two questions there, right? Is it net positive, and what's the incentive, right?
Mm-hmm.
The challenge to the adoption part is, well, how am I going to afford that? Right. And so I think one of the ways that you see that expense be passed through is through the premium for the product at the consumer end, right? Which ultimately means that the consumer is going to have to value that traceability component such that they're willing to pay a little bit more for it, right?
Mhm.
I just don't see government subsidies as being the kind of long-term economic incentive that's going to drive that adoption. I don't think they're going to last quite that long. I don't think they're going to be powerful enough to move that through. Is it net positive to the producer to be able to do those things? If it's net positive in the way that it makes it's more economical for them, sure, right? I'm trying to think about an ecological or a sustainability way that you would, if a cattle producer outside of the economics can trace, or a Walmart can trace their beef supply to a particular farm here in Texas, how does that benefit the producer other than through economic means? Because it doesn't necessarily, because you can trace something doesn't necessarily mean that the methods that were used to produce that animal are more sustainable, right? Those are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
I think the net positive aspect is to the producer, where the grower is going to come more through the way they're improving their land and their water resources and their fertilizer resources and retentions, more so than the traceability aspect of it. That matters more, I think, to the consumer than it's going to matter to the producer, unless there's an economic incentive tied to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that I think it's great to have the desire to want to improve your soil health, to improve your the quality of the products that you're raising. But with all of this talk about sustainability, my view on that as a producer is that a sustainable operation has to be a profitable operation.
Right.
Because if profitability doesn't exist, then sustainability doesn't exist, and then we don't have production. And so trying to make the two of those things coincide with each other in a positive way that benefits not only what the consumers are asking for, but also benefits the producers for willing to invest in the technology or invest in a particular practice, which isn't, completely proven. I think it's proven in probably, I don't want to say isolated cases, but certainly a few cases. But one of the challenges I think that we face in production agriculture is it's not a level playing field. And, the challenges that I have are completely different than the challenges that my neighbor has, based on our availability to resources, based on our access to capital, based on our environmental conditions, based on, there can be a storm that's a mile away from me and that guy gets completely obliterated and I have a super healthy crop and everything works well. And so I think part of that challenge, it seems to me, has to rise above and beyond what just technology can provide, that it has to be able to provide the consumer with an appropriate perspective on, all things aren't equal, right? Like not all factors can be included in these components that the consumer wants. So how do we effectively relay that information to consumers to develop that understanding, and how do we relay it to processors even and retailers,
Right.
Who are asking for that, to communicate that and make sure that that consumer base understands it. And I don't know if there's anything in the works there, or if there's any talks about how those things can be kind of intertwined so that there's not just this technological benefit of traceability, but there's an understanding of the perspective of what the word traceability and sustainability actually even mean.
Yeah. How you connect those dots to the consumer is is tricky. There's a recent example that comes to mind about how you may be able to do that in a way that's not economics. I mean, I think that I don't remember how long ago this occurred, but there was a recent understanding that in certain when you go to buy beef from a store, right, it'll have a label on it that gives you the grade, right? But then it'll, in some cases, say made in the US, right? Most consumers would have assumed that that means that that animal was made in the US from beginning to end, right?
Mhm.
However, that's not always the case. That animal could have just been finished in the US or finished and slaughtered in the US, but raised in Brazil or Uruguay, right? And most consumers, I don't think, were aware of that. And so they
Right.
thought they were buying a US product when in fact they
Mhm.
were buying a quarter of a US product. And so to the extent that traceability can provide transparency, maybe that's a better way to put it, transparency around where this stuff is actually coming from. And if you can find that it came from 44 farms here in Northeast Texas, and maybe I want to go check that farm out, right? Maybe at the least I'm going to go look at it online and see what's it look like? What do these animals look like in the field? What's the operation look like? And so maybe a way beyond the economics is through transparency and connectivity to what it is that's being consumed. That's easier to do with animal protein than it is with the row crop type space. But that's one thought.
You know, one of the things that I think I'm really fascinated by what you're doing just as a company is that you're kind of all things tech, right? So if it is tech, I'm assuming if it's tech and it focuses on ag solutions, your company is interested in talking to those inventors and those entrepreneurs. What are some of the things that are coming to you as ideas that you are really excited about? I know there's probably some do not disclose and some things like that that you probably have to be a little careful about, but what are some areas that you see are going to be influenced by some of the new tech that you're seeing?
We're at a tipping point right now, I think, in the
Mhm.
ag tech space where, and this is sort of specific to the machinery aspect of it, but there's two ways that this could potentially go, right? Conventional machinery becomes bigger and more autonomous, right? John Deere's new D8R or DR8 fully autonomous tillage tractor. It's an impressive piece of equipment, but it is larger and it is focused on a part of the production process that is quite tedious, right? And it's also tied to a conventional practice around tillage, right? So one strategic or long-term pathway is that this machinery continues to get bigger, it continues to get more autonomous, and it continues to focus on easier problems to solve first, technologically speaking, and then harder problems to solve later. Planting is the most difficult thing to do in conventional operations autonomously, right? It's just very nuanced to get that particular part right. So I think you'll either see it go more that way, or, which is the way that I think it will go, is smaller, more swarm, electric, which means you have to then manage battery powered instead of diesel operated. I really think that you're going to start to see these processes that have been more mechanized and done on the larger scale come to a more smaller swarm type. And I use the swarm type in a positive aspect. I think you're going to see them move that more. And I think one of the other things that's going to drive that is as practices shift from hopefully more conventional to more regenerative, that allows you to execute those practices in a more regional aspect, And sometimes those regional opportunities are much smaller, 100 acres, 50 acres, right? You're not going to need a huge John Deere tillage machine to do that operation. Number one, because you're likely not tilling anymore. You're no-till planting or something in that regard. But as those practices move to more regenerative, you can do them on a more regional scale, which means the overall operation tends to be smaller, right? In some cases, it's the same thing for livestock production. And because of that, you can get by with these smaller, more autonomous, more battery-powered machines, right? And so I think that's a very interesting tipping point that we're at right now. The other aspect of this will be the incorporation of AI, artificial intelligence, not artificial insemination. Sometimes in the ag space, you have to make that distinction. But you're seeing it in all aspects of production. I had a conversation on the podcast 2 weeks ago where a biologicals company had identified a series of 8 different microbes that they have put onto a seed coating to address sort of 3 key areas around disease resistance, nutrient management, and then the third one's escaping me. But they took a starting block of thousands of these microbes. They put them into an AI model that started to recognize patterns around which of these microbes did better individually at first at solving these 3 different buckets, right? And then they said, okay, well, now individually, how do these microbes work in pairs? How do they work in triplets? How do they work in 4s? And the only way that would have been possible in any reasonable amount of time was if you had an artificial intelligence model making sense of patterns in this otherwise disparate data set. You're seeing it in the analysis of historical crop yields and health metrics through NDVI imagery over 10 years or 5 years, whatever sort of history is there. The whole point and one of the huge benefits of these large language models or these artificial intelligence models is to make sense of patterns that are otherwise indiscernible to people. And if you can make sense or at least extract insights from this raw information, then harking back to the military days, you've now turned information into intelligence. And then you can act on that intelligence in a way that you were not able to do 10 years ago because you couldn't make sense of the patterns in the information. That would be sort of strategy number 2. The third would be, from a technology adoption standpoint, we are seeing the more successful and the more adoptable technologies moving beyond just regurgitating out information, right? I think gone are the days of here's your soil report, here's your map, here's your name it, that used to just be a report that you would get, right? Now the demand is such that, well, I need to make sense of that information. You need to tell me what to do with it. Or in the cases where this is applicable, you identify what's happening, you provide or recognize how to solve it, and then you solve it autonomously or you solve it automatically, right? This whole see and spray technology through Blue River and John Deere, there's a couple of other companies that are working on this now, where in a single path, in real time, I'm either identifying crop loss, right, through another technology, or I'm identifying that's a pigweed, and I'm spraying it instantly. And I'm doing it as a spot treatment, so I'm not spraying the whole field. I'm saving chemical application, and I'm immediately recognizing what I'm seeing, and I'm applying a solution to it in real time. And so I really think that you're going to start to see more adoption through technologies that move all the way through the spectrum of information gathering to solution automation. So those would be some thoughts that I would put forth as sort of big ticket directions.
I would say that, just listening to you talk about that, those three methodologies, we just were in Kansas City for the Top Producer Summit. And the Top Producer Summit is a really interesting conference in that it is a ag conference that focuses very little on big machinery, and it focuses 100% on the new, ways of thinking, the new ways to use data, the new technology. So really injecting how science can help, a farmer to do the things that they're doing. And I would say that that is very much what we're seeing, and certainly saw this year, is that we are seeing, ideas for small autonomous equipment. We're seeing a lot of things that are, granular to the field, in terms of the cameras that are on the drones, the way the data is explored, and then the AI that interfaces with that, so that you are getting in the moment data about what's going on in your field or whatever it is. And I actually was super excited about just that year over year improvement of what we were talking about with AI. Last year at Top Producer, it was very much like, oh, you need to be using it, but there wasn't a lot of very specific ideas about what it even does or how to use it. And now this year, it was almost like every breakout session, it was, this is what it does. This is how you use it. This is the app where you get it. This is how we're using it in your field. It was actually a really pretty cool year over year explosion of the understanding of AI. So I think you're spot on with the trends that you're seeing, in terms of just like in one year from one conference to the next, how that dialogue about the use of all three of those methodologies, became more the topic of conversation and more specific about what we do with it.
And that was in 1 year.
One
It was 1
year,
year, right?
one
Fast
year.
forward to a year from now, and I think that your comments around those conversations are going to be, in the way that it's going right now, exponentially more frequent and more common.
Yeah. And just that use to be able to, like you said, to make sense of patterns. I was at another conference, a dairy conference in December, and there was a technology company that got up and talked about how they had, taken all of the diseases that are associated with milk. Right. So all of the things that lactose is supposedly supposed to do your body, they had taken it and they'd created a huge map. And I think it was, I don't know, it was well over 300 things that milk was supposed to be detrimental. And they had used AI to map those 300 plus things and break it down to science as to why lactose was not the problem. And then on the flip side, they turned around and they did each individual protein of all the things that those proteins did that was a benefit to the body. And that was 100% AI created. And it was amazing to watch they put their map up and how you could navigate that. And I thought, it is amazing that when we know the right questions, these tools can really help us formulate the right answers that have, just a lot more to them than what maybe the human brain could just come up with on its own.
Was it the idea that sort of lactose had been vilified as
Vilified. Yeah, and they were working in partnership with Mayo.
Okay. Yep.
And then they were using it as a way to inform marketing. So, they had, the best of the medical backing behind this, and then they were turning around and using that data in order to create strong marketing messages to consumers. Of it really was, the big thing was buy more cheese, eat more cheese was the gist of it. But they were using AI to help inform that and to really combat misconceptions. So it was really interesting to see how AI was being used in such a simple yet incredibly effective way.
And that's not even on the sort of technological side of it. or the veterinary side of it. That's on the business
Right.
side of it, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's how we address this issue. Going back to what we talked about before about transparency, is that I think that as producers become more like, I think we all come to the table with certain assumptions. I can tell you that when we started embracing some technology on our farm, I thought this is a complete and utter waste of time and money. And then when so you come to the table with that assumption, but then when you are open-minded enough to embrace that, and then you say to yourself, well, how did we survive without this? Or there's no way that I would continue to farm in some respects on our farm if we hadn't embraced some of that technology. But ignorance is bliss, and we just don't know what we don't know a lot of times. And if we'll let go of those assumptions and embrace something new and discover ways in which technology can help drive our narrative, besides just the technical things in the field, but drive that narrative in the sense that now it's putting the producers in charge of really communicating our message to the public to develop this transparency. To me, when you put those two things together, it can supply a powerful message that not only do you have data on
Right.
on the actual production side, but now you've got some data on the communication side. And now how do we effectively, get that message out to retailers and consumers, I think is a pretty powerful message. And it is pretty exciting, I think, to think where that's going to go in only 365 days from now.
Ron, if I can ask that initial perspective you had on the use of technology on your particular farm, was that based on just a familial, historical, this is the way we've done it, so we're going to always keep doing it this way? Or was it just that the value around what it was that could be provided by that just wasn't strong enough, or the use case for how that technology had to be used, it just was poorly communicated, or wasn't there enough to where you said, yeah, I can understand this, or I can get behind what it's going to do for me?
Well, I think for me, we've kind of always, I think, bucked the idea of traditions on our farm and traditional practices. And so I always tell people that I'm a 5th-generation cattle rancher, but a 1st-generation farmer, because we had to, build our operation really from after we left a cattle operation to figure out new ways of doing things. And so I think that created some open-mindedness for me, honestly. In my particular case, because we had to create our farm kind of from this, this space where we didn't have these assets that we could draw from prior generations, that it was really a cost thing for me. I thought, man, why in the world would I spend that much money, which to me at the time was a lot of money? Why would I invest that kind of money when I can do it myself? And I think that a lot of times we find ourselves in agriculture saying, well, why would I pay someone to do whatever job it is when I can just do it myself? But we do that, I think, without really understanding the value that other things can bring. So there's a difference between looking at something as an expense and realizing that expense can actually bring value. And I think a lot of times we look at things in production agriculture, and that is maybe somewhat through a traditional type lens, that, oh, it's an expense. But then as a result, what we end up doing is we end up stepping on, $100 bills so we can pick up a nickel,
Right.
that we can think we can just get a little bit, more out of if we would just squeeze that nickel a little bit harder.
Right.
And meanwhile, we forget to, we're not even aware of the fact that we're stepping on all of this money as a result of it. And so for me, that really was what it was about. And it was a real big lesson for me in understanding the differentiation between the two of those things.
Yeah, it's a great distinction because oftentimes when we think about technology adoption at the producer or grower level, is this going to be perceived as an added expense, or will this be perceived as a replacement to something that I'm already doing that will optimize or improve the way it's been done before? The example that I kind of think about, there's a documentary, a 4-part documentary series out. It's called The Roots So Deep You Can See the Devil Down There. It's a really interesting documentary, and it follows these 4 or 5 maybe it's less than that, different farms. They're right next to each other, and they've intentionally done that. One is conventional, and one is more regenerative. And these are cattle producers. And Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, kind of down here in the Southeast. And they follow these farms over a couple of years. And because they share a fence line, and they bring in these teams of data science or university researchers from all sort of aspects of soil, sequestration. They put up eddy flux towers. They're doing bird studies. They're doing animal health. A couple folks that come out and do animal health. And one of the things that the more regenerative producer said was, he used to be a conventional cattle operator, and they were planting and fertilizing these grasses regularly, right, just to keep the pastures up. And they weren't doing any sort of adaptive multi-paddock grazing. These were big areas, and the cattle were just grazing freely. And he said, wait a minute, if I can just get rid of my hay equipment, right, because now I'm rotating these cattle in such a way that allows this land to lay fallow long enough so that by the time I cycle back around, that's grown up again, then that's the introduction of that as a practice, amp grazing, is a overall expense reduction for me, such that I no longer now need hay equipment, right? Now, the thing that I think it's in episode 2, it doesn't really give homage to is that, yes, you got rid of those things. However, now you need a no-till drill, right, to be able to plant that ryegrass in the winter so that those cattle have something to eat because you're no longer feeding hay, right? Like they didn't really say whether or not he was renting that from somebody else, or if he was contracting it as a service, or if he actually bought it. I mean, I get it, right? So we're kind of thinking about that on our farm now, right? We've got some hay equipment. We usually cut once or twice a year, and then we feed them in the winter. But if we can cut these pastures in such a way that we've got fallow land and we can rotate them more frequently, then can we get rid of the hay equipment? Can that be an expense reduction for us? The benefit there is that, all of what we produce is for us, right? We don't sell any of it, but can that begin to be a pathway for us to improve the quality of our beef, essentially, and also kind of bring some of our expenses down? So it's a great point, Ron, about how is this going to be perceived, and how am I going to think about this as either an expense or an improvement?
Yeah. A quick question because I want to make sure that we get to your podcast a little bit, because you're doing some really cool things on the podcast front too. But before we leave your tech company, just a quick question about like client acquisition. Are you looking for new ideas? And if so, could you talk a little bit about the process of how someone should approach your company if they're wanting some help getting to market?
Sure. We've certainly got capacity to bring on new projects. Historically, most of our inbound inquiries and interests have come just from word of mouth, right? The podcast, I think, maybe unintentionally serves as, I hate to use this word, but serves as a funnel, if you will, sometimes for interest, at least in ag or ag tech. And so sometimes that generally helps. But if there's I think the main point to make here is wherever the inventor or the entrepreneur is, or even the established business is in that process, I think we can support, right? And oftentimes that support comes around a need, right? An internal and known need to move through this particular event or challenge. But often that comes through, and this takes some sussing out a little bit, it comes through a pain point, right? Gosh, we can't figure out how to get past this one particular technological challenge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, let's talk about what specifically that is and how we may be able to help you guys or gals move through that. And so those would sort of be the primary ways in which I think folks come to us. We're, available on most website and LinkedIn and stuff like that. So if you want to find out more about what we're doing, the case studies page is also pretty up to date. You can see some of the things we've worked on in the past, but that's generally how that has worked in the past.
You've been listening to part 1 of our interview with Michael DeSa on the Ag Inspo podcast, hosted by Ron Rabo and Rena Striegel. Catch Ag Inspo on Transition Point Business Advisors and Farm Journal's YouTube channels, or tune in on your favorite podcast platform. For more details on today's guest and the resources mentioned, check out the show notes below. Join us next time as we continue our conversation with Michael and explore his Vets and Ag podcast.